Welcome to yet another day of the Interstitial Cystitis Association virtual Walk for IC Awareness and Walk for an IC Cure. The interstitial cystitis myth that we're going to bust today is going to be answered by the Interstitial Cystitis Association fact of the day. And so here we go. The interstitial cystitis myth of the day is that there is no research being done on interstitial cystitis. And this is something that I actually see quite a bit being on social media. I feel like there's a lot of chatter sometimes about we need research isn't being done on IC, we're being left behind, no one cares about us and research in the field. And I want to bust this myth for you, especially because the Interstitial Cystitis Association has worked so hard to make sure that that is not true. So if you look at some of the history of interstitial cystitis and its research, people have been trying to figure out what the heck is going on with this condition for quite a long time. And I get that back in the day, there was a big lull in basically from 1914 to 1978, there was a huge lull in research. And really even from after 1978 to about the early 2000s and maybe even into the late 1990s, there was also another big lull, right? So Dr. Hunter actually first described interstitial cystitis in 1914, where he actually identified ulcerations in the bladder lining, right? And those were known as Hunter's lesions, and that condition was deemed interstitial cystitis. And for a long time, all the way until researchers in 1978 decided to actually look a little bit more into this condition. Researchers at, I believe it was Stanford, actually looked and found that actually people with urinary urgency frequency and severe pelvic pain didn't have. Less than 10% of them had these ulcerations that Dr. Hunter in 1914 had described. And so that's where bladder pain syndrome, painful bladder syndrome started to get thrown around in addition to the interstitial cystitis diagnosis, because they found that over 90% of people didn't have this perceived or perceptible bladder lining pathology or something actually physically wrong with the bladder lining, which was like mind blown in 1978. For a long time, a lot of people were just like, oh, good, we understood that. And then again, because, the incidence numbers were still relatively low at that time, because the definition of IC had been so narrow, it was still considered very rare, and not a lot of people were looking into the condition itself. That changed a ton in the 90s and the 2000s, and to the point where there was a huge study done called the RICE study, and that was called the Rand Interstitial Cystitis Epidemiology Study. And that was the first study that actually surveyed 130,000 households and used a little bit broader definition of interstitial cystitis, one where we kind of know today of urinary urgency frequency and pelvic pain. And that's the statistic that we quote nowadays, where in the United States, it's up to more like 12 million people that have these symptoms and probably have this condition. Concurrently, and this is still going on right now, there is also an NIDDK supported study called the MAP study, which is the Multidisciplinary Action for the Study of Chronic Pelvic Pain, of which interstitial cystitis symptoms and the condition are being significantly studied in those phases of that treatment. Phase 1 is already completed. Phase 2 is going on, and it's going to even move on into phase 3. And so I want to get across in busting this myth is that there has been, over the last 20 years, more research that has been done on IC than ever before. And many people care a lot about figuring out what the cause is, but the more that we research it, right, the more questions that we have, and the more that we're seeing that it's actually a much more complex condition than is it being a simple bladder lining issue. So that is actually should be really exciting to you guys, because the Interstitial Cystitis Association actually advocates every single year for the NIH funding to remain high, right? So that they can carve out special considerations for people with interstitial cystitis, people with chronic pelvic pain conditions, chronic pain conditions in general, and looking out for all of the things that might be going on with somebody that's dealing with a chronic pelvic pain condition like interstitial cystitis. And so the Interstitial Cystitis Association has tirelessly advocated and successfully advocated for interstitial cystitis to be included in a small subset of conditions that is eligible for another set of funding from the Department of Defense. And that leads me to your interstitial cystitis challenge for today. There's going to be a separate interview where we interview researchers from Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, Michigan, who are actually looking at studying a potential diagnostic test for interstitial cystitis. And it's actually looking at a potential urine marker in the bladder. More on that in a separate video. If you want to see more about it, you're going to go to icstudy.org for more information. But your challenge today is to watch that video of that interview and also to request your urine kit and recruit 2 other people to do the quote unquote normal test as well. So if you have interstitial cystitis, you can do the test. And then they send you 2 other ones where a male person and a female person can also submit their urine, even though they don't have IC. And so that is your challenge for today, is to request your kit today. Watch that video where we go over a lot of other specifics about the study and about the hypothesis of the study, and make sure that you are now more informed to bust the IC myth that no research is being done on IC. You are actively going to participate in research for IC. And yes, we are going to go and we're going to learn more about this condition. And the ICA is tirelessly going to help to further research in the field for IC. Have a great day. Don't forget to log your steps, and we'll see you tomorrow.